70% of suicides in America. Yet somehow, it's the left who is failing men. And this is on top of all the ugly things I talked about in the last section, like spree shooters, or how about acts of family annihilation, where white men wake up one day and decide to murder their entire family, their wife and their kids, because they lost their job or dealing with depression, both of which may or may not also end in suicide. Do I even want to get into pornography addiction? Pornography consumption is more prominent and tends to be more deviant in red states. You southern red states love your femboys and your porn. And pornography addiction, on occasion, spirals out into white men committing spree shootings. If any other group in this country had these types of disproportionate negative health outcomes, it would be all over every news space on a regular basis with explicit detail. They would call it the white male spree shooter problem and not the male loneliness crisis, because the reality is, it's the white male loneliness crisis. I recently watched a video by CoffeeZilla where he talks about the proliferation of gambling in our daily society. Shout out to him for the video as a whole, but I couldn't help be frustrated that he didn't touch on who the targets of this type of stuff is, which is young white men scared about their position in society, hoping that something as simple and easy and low effort as gambling can pull them out of a situation where they might be at the bottom of the economic reality and push them to the top. And yes, you do have people like Kevin Hart, Drake, even Drewski and Joe Budden appear in some of these gambling commercials, which, by the way, shout out to Kai Cenat for being one of the few to turn like these multi-million dollar gambling company deals. He turned one down. So yes, black figures are a part of the promotion of these sites, but this is just due diligence on the part of these gambling companies to hit every corner of men they can think of. The real targets are young white men looking to feel like winners to grasp an opportunity. And this works because they know how desperate people are, how big the gulf between the haves and the have-nots is growing, and how no amount of talent or hard work creates a solid path to a viable, successful life in this country anymore. Once again, your grandparents killed the New Deal in the 1960s so that black people couldn't live too close to you. And mind you, problem gambling has a higher suicide rate than any other form of addiction. And people like Joe Rogan promote it regularly in between complaining about the masculinity crisis to his predominantly white male audience, all for the love of money, which he doesn't need. He got it from Saudi Arabia. And again, this is not to say that black and other men don't suffer from these issues, that the suicide rate for men in general is abnormally high over the last 40 years. But considering all the other ways in which black people tend to lead in negative health outcome categories, you got to think that white men are working extra hard to outdo structural racism to take the lead here, all while simultaneously escaping the scrutiny and disrespect that usually comes with it. But here's the thing. This particular social problem is just as influenced by structural issues with white men as social problems affecting black men and black people in general and everyone else. It's just a different function of the same exact structure. Often you'll see right-wing men in our media focus directly or tangentially discuss the male loneliness epidemic. We have Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Rogan, etc. And historically, this is relevant as the men's rights movement from the 70s was born out of men attempting to come together to address the social issues that men face. However, the original men's rights movement was a progressive and almost feminist movement that was eventually co-opted by right-wing chauvinistic thinking, and that's exactly where the modern manosphere exists currently. And right now, we're just seeing history repeating itself. Many white men, white male-oriented spaces have attempted to lay the blame for these issues at the aspects of modern society. They blame women, immigrants, gay people, etc. for promoting degeneracy. And somehow that is causing like factories to shut down in their Midwestern towns, even though they can't quite connect the dots there for you. They don't have to, because that's what you kind of want to believe. And they want you to believe this because if you don't, then you might accidentally engage with structures of patriarchy and capitalism that have been used to kill as many opportunities for normal white men as they have for anyone else. And mind you, this is why people like Kirk argue against women being independent and getting educated. The whole trad wife thing that has become popular in the last couple of years is a marketing ploy to convince women that they were better off in the 1950s when they couldn't get a divorce.
The 3 M's make you a better citizen and more conservative, which of course is mortgage, marriage, and mating.
In fact, ending no-fault divorce is literally something many right-wingers want to do right now. They want women to not have autonomy, often using the fact that women are so unhappy now as evidence of the failure of feminism, which is ironic because it actually just proves the left's point about everything. One thing that never gets brought up when we talk about the male loneliness epidemic, because it takes the focus away from explicitly men, is the fact that while the suicide rate for men is abnormally high and has been for decades now, women are actually more likely to attempt suicide than men. They're not doing any better under the current situation. And in another sick twist, the only reason why their suicide rate isn't higher is because of the methods women tend to choose for killing themselves versus men. To be blunt, men are more likely to use guns in attempting suicide, which is much more lethal than the methods women tend to use, such as attempting to overdose on pills. Thus, women are more likely to survive, creating opportunities for future intervention. And white men are more likely to own firearms, often as a manifestation of achieving masculine status and or the irrational fear that black people or immigrants or terrorists or wherever else are dangerous to them, so they want to carry these guns around in case they have to become John Rambo one day. And ironically, that just ends up making it easier for them to kill themselves when things don't go well for them. A paper published in the National Institute of Health said the following.
Themes of white male anxiety are common in recent social science research. For example, Carlson shows that white male anxiety surrounding perceived threats to their dominant status explains high rates of gun ownership among whites. Kimmel also demonstrates that the pressure to be economically successful, particularly in times of economic uncertainty, is a major source of distress among white men. Indeed, the narrative of the erosion of the authority of white men and perceived status threats is evident in the formation of the Tea Party movement and the rise of men's rights groups. Research on health and well-being also supports these notions. Case and Deaton show that suicide rates among white males have increased, which they speculate have been fueled by hopelessness. In response to this study, Phillips hypothesized that white men may have experienced greater increases in suicide because they were socialized to believe that they would experience upward social mobility and economic prosperity in a way that racial minority men were not. In other words, these men had further to fall.
This excerpt mentions Michael Kimmel and his concept of aggrieved entitlement. And while Kimmel has for various reasons fallen out of favor in gender studies, I don't think anyone has a better framework for examining the uniqueness of this specific social ill for white men specifically. Kimmel states the following in a paper titled Suicide by Mass Murder.
Feeling aggrieved, wronged by the world, these are typical adolescent feelings, common to many boys and girls. What transforms the aggrieved into mass murderers is also a sense of entitlement, a sense of using violence against others, making others hurt as you, yourself, might hurt. Aggrieved entitlement inspires revenge against those who have wronged you. It is compensation for humiliation. Humiliation is emasculation. Humiliate someone and you take away his manhood. For many men, humiliation must be avenged or you cease to be a man. Aggrieved entitlement is a gendered emotion, a fusion of that humiliating loss of manhood and the moral obligation and entitlement to get it back.
These men have been told all their lives that they should align themselves with these structures and traditions, that masculinity should be a certain way, and it's their job to ensure that if they abide by certain rules and traditions, that they will be rewarded. And in that process, they become foot soldiers or maybe even stormtroopers for these structures. And being a soldier is costly, and the cost is their happiness, well-being, and possibly their lives. And it's all to protect the system that does not have their best interest in mind. And more, so many of these men are recognizing that the structure is not holding up its end of the bargain, and they're looking around at their peers slowly dying, but instead of recognizing the system as the problem, they listen to the system explain to them that the real problem is trans middle schoolers playing soccer. And for a long time, it was really hard for me to make sense of that. How so many of these men can fall for such obvious misdirection, and why so few recognize the real problem. But then as I've studied the manosphere and the right wing over and over, I realized that it's not because it makes sense, but because it makes community. It's because the cohesive identity of white men is literally worth dying for from their perspective. The real challenge that the left has in attracting men is the fact that it means deconstructing this ideological framework and reconstructing the concept of community and kinship for a lot of white men that, let's be honest, a lot of us don't want to be around. It's why so many white men on the left hold on to those same frameworks when they get here, allowing many problems to repeat themselves. And any white man on the left that tells you otherwise is not to be trusted. I still get emails from fans of insert white leftist guy here saying, "Why are you so mean about white guys?" I can't with y'all. It's that sense of belonging and community that creates a barrier, and understanding that, it makes sense how so much of our daily lives have been atomized to reduce community, because it makes it so the only community left for many of these white men are these reactionary right-wing spaces. I remember when I was a teen that rock and metal were much more prominent parts of white male culture. There were much more popular genres of music that were intrinsically anti-establishment, anti-corporate, and unsurprisingly, within all that convergence of media companies, you saw them purposefully begin to exclude those types of very much white-oriented music in favor of music that was more easily commodifiable. Deja Sade does a great analysis on how Eminem, believe it or not, was probably the last true anti-establishment white megastar figure holding off the full control of MAGA for white minds today. Because today, most images of viable white masculinity that are popular are very much right-wing, very much corporately sponsored, happy dog, happy dad, whatever the beer company is, all these podcasts. It's not just Charlie Kirk, it's Theo Vaughn, it's Aiden Ross, it's Brilliant Idiots, or whatever dude's name is that be hanging with Charlemagne. And this is why Trump went to all of those podcasts, kind of just casually saying whatever the fuck he wanted with no pushback. And now all of them are like, I can't believe he didn't release the Epstein files. We were tricked. You fucking idiots. You weren't tricked, you're willfully being stupid. There's still this veneer and myth that new media like YouTube is a space where people can be more free, and that's true to an extent. But money still talks. Sponsors pay more than Patreon and views combined, if you find the right ones.
The dungeons in Raid Shadow Legends are magnificent.
And these right-wing institutions know this. They learned this back during Gamergate, when Steve Bannon astrotursed Milo Yiannopoulos to supercharge the alt-right, and look who's back to the main stage in the replacement of Charlie Kirk for Turning Point USA. It may seem like I'm being flippant here, but I genuinely just feel sad. Getting back to media analysis for a second, I can't not think of the War Boys from the Mad Max movies. I remember watching Fury Road back in 2015, recognizing that it was a brave decision to not just have these foot soldiers in the movie be nameless peons to be killed in the background. Instead, the War Boys were this great metaphor for what's happening to boys in our world right now. We watch as one of them goes through a metamorphosis to find meaning in a seemingly meaningless life, greatly through developing a new community apart from his cult of origin. I found a quote from the Mad Max fan wiki that is sourced to George Miller, though I couldn't verify this. Still, it's too perfect to leave out here.
These war boys have no choice. They're culturally impoverished. There's no books, there's no internet, there's no theaters, no radio, no music. All they have are the detritus of the past, and they refashion it so a steering wheel becomes a religious artifact. They do the sign of the V8, the engine they've scarified onto their bodies, because an engine is much more permanent than a human body. They chrome their teeth, because chrome is such a rare thing. So like all cults, this is another cult, invented by Immortan Joe in order to get people to die on his behalf.
What's so effective about them as a metaphor is how these boys reinforce each other. They're a community before anything. They actively have some touching and endearing moments of brotherhood within their cult, which is something that needs to be recognized. It's why it works. But at the end of the day, regardless of those minor positive moments, this is a closed circle. They're not allowed out and not allowed to see the world beyond their existence, lest what happens to Nux, the character in the first Mad Max, happens to more of them. And this is exactly what happens in a lot of these male-oriented right-wing spaces. These boys and young men spend countless hours in group chats, Reddit pages, and the comment sections of their favorite creators, creating culture around the cult, reinforcing their behavior and paradoxically toxifying each other where it would be incredibly hard for them to ever find community elsewhere. And the result is death. Socially, if they're lucky, but eternally for more than we like to think about. And in the meantime, the real-life Immortan Joe and his various cronies enrich themselves through their sacrifices. Don't look up how much money Trump has made in the variety of crypto scams and contracts in just the first year of his presidency, all off the backs of these same white men who voted for him, whose